Tonight we have a really great event. It's speaking engagement of Robert Meeropol, who is the son of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. He'll talk about the Rosenberg Fund for Children. But first I want to tell you a little bit about the Northwest Constitutional Rights Center. This organization was founded in 2004 with proceeds from a settlement by the Portland Police Bureau after the Portland Police Bureau recognized that they had violated the constitutional rights of political activists in 2002 and 2003. The Northwest Constitutional Rights Center works to protect the civil rights of people of color, immigrants, political activists, and other vulnerable populations that receive the brunt from law enforcement. And so we're working to create a system in Portland that addresses police accountability, that is civilian controlled, and that has the power to conduct investigations that are independent of the police bureau. And we're also working to eliminate the practice of racial profiling by the Portland Police Bureau. It's a practice that has caused a great division among our communities. We know that African Americans and Latinos are pulled over and searched at greater rates than their white counterparts, and certainly greater rates than one would expect from the proportion of the population. So we certainly have a problem, and we're working with the Bureau so that it adopts policies that will address these concerns, that are policies that are also based on community input. And so we're working both with the police and the community to resolve this problem and to have greater and more efficient ways of holding the police accountable. Tonight, though, we're going to be talking about the Green Scare in a historical context. The Green Scare, as some of you may know, is sort of this new era that we have entered in the world of political activism. And it really kind of got started, I would say, several years ago, certainly after September 11th, 2001, but it really has peaked, and it started peaking back in December of last year, December of 2005, when the FBI started conducting arrests of various environmental and animal rights activists who were later charged with arson, attempted arson, conspiracy to commit arson, but were also labeled and prosecuted as terrorists. And Lauren Regan from the Civil Liberties Defense Center will talk about that. Let me introduce Robert first, and then I'll introduce Lauren, and I'll let them take over. Robert is the younger son, as I said, of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. In 1953, when Robert was 6 years old, the U.S. government executed his parents for conspiring to steal the secret of the atomic bomb after the most hotly debated trials in U.S. history. And for 30 years, Robert has been a progressive activist, author, and public speaker. In the 70s, he and his brother Michael successfully sued the FBI and the CIA to force the release of 300,000 previously secret documents about their parents. Robert graduated from law school in 1985 after earning undergraduate and graduate degrees in anthropology. Robert served 2 state court clerkships with the Massachusetts Appeals Court and spent several years practicing corporate law in the private sector. In 1990, after leaving private practice, Robert started the Rosenberg Fund for Children and now serves as the executive director. The RFC is a public foundation that provides for the educational and emotional needs of both targeted activist youth and children in the U.S. whose parents have been harassed, injured, jailed, lost jobs, or died in the course of their progressive activities. In its 17-year history, the fund has awarded more than $3.5 million in grants to benefit hundreds of children. Pick up their newsletter over there. Robert's memoir, An Execution of the Family, copies of which are also found on that table, was published by St. Martin's Press on the 50th anniversary of his parents' execution. The book details his odyssey from Rosenberg's son to political activist and leader of the Rosenberg Fund for Children.
I feel a sense of urgency in speaking to you during Bush's second term because in too many ways, 2007 reminds me of 1953. That was the year my parents were executed. And I'm going to address this reverberation, historic reverberation or echo in 2 ways. Specifically by looking at my parents' case as what I call a capital conspiracy case and considering the potential for similar cases today. And more generally by looking at the political climate today and comparing it to that of 1953. 1953. Now, for well over a decade, I've been speaking out against capital punishment as the only attorney in the United States with a special heritage. My brother and I are the only people in U.S. history, at least as far as I know, to have had both their parents executed. And it seems to me that in the last decade, there's been a great capital punishment debate in this country. And that debate has really focused almost exclusively on murder cases. But my parents' case, which was also a capital case, was not a murder case. In fact, in looking at my parents' case, the starting point is to understand what it was not. It was not a treason case. It was not even an espionage case, as the media always reports. My parents were actually charged with conspiracy to commit espionage, which means that they were charged with planning to commit espionage. In the climate of the summer of 2001, this kind of anomalous capital case, or what seemed like an anomalous capital case, was primarily of historic or academic interest. But that changed after September 11th, along with a lot of other things. You know, the case of Zacharias Moussaoui, I'm sure you're familiar with that name, well, he was only charged with conspiracy, but the government wanted the death penalty in his case. And who knows what will ultimately happen to the detainees at Guantanamo that the executive branch of government has designated enemy combatants. And now, the government seeks to paint domestic dissenters as terrorists. And given this kind of climate, all of a sudden, my parents' kind of case has become, once again, vitally important. So let's take a look at how my parents came to be executed, even though they were only convicted of conspiracy. Now, my father, Julius Rosenberg, was arrested in July of 1950, a few weeks after the Korean War began, and he was executed along with my mother, Ethel, on June 19, 1953, a few weeks before it ended. So this case is bracketed by the Korean War. Now, it's been feeling to me a lot like the McCarthy period in the U.S. again lately. And I'm talking, when I talk about the McCarthy period, I'm talking about the period in the late 1940s and early 1950s in this country. And there are people in this audience who are clearly old enough to remember, but there are others who are not. And rather than give those of you who were not around then a dry history of that period, I'll tell you a couple of stories to give you a flavor of the times. Now, it's usually at this point that I take out a prop, and this prop is my Boston Red Sox baseball cap. But since I lost it in the spring and haven't bought a new one, I can't do that. You'll just have to imagine me with my Boston Red Sox cap on my head. Because I want to tell you a couple of stories about baseball as we approach the postseason playoffs. You know, when I was growing up as a kid, there was no such thing as interleague play. The American League teams played against the American League, the National League teams played against the National League. And there was only one exception, and that was the World Series, where the winners of each pennant played each other. But, you know, there was another exception, and that exception was during spring training. And during spring training, during the early 1950s, the Cincinnati Reds played a baseball game, an exhibition game, against the New York Yankees. And the Reds won, which, given my baseball cap, I thought was pretty good. But the next day, in the sports pages, there were small headlines that read, "Reds beat Yanks 5-2. This caused an uproar. Dozens of people wrote into the Cincinnati Reds front office letters like, "Don't you know our boys are dying in Korea? It's not good for morale to have Reds beating Yanks even on the sports pages." And then there were the nastier letters, the ones with a little bit of a sharp tone. And anyway, what kind of a baseball team are you to call yourself the Reds? Well, Cincinnati's owners didn't think it was funny. They hurriedly called a press conference at which their general manager announced that their name was being officially changed to the Cincinnati Redlegs. And to this day, that's what their name is, and that's how the Cincinnati Redlegs got their name. Of course, everybody always calls them the Reds anyway. And it wasn't all fun and games. The base commander at our military base in the Philippines posted the following notice on the main base bulletin board. It said, "The Bill of Rights and Constitution are not to be posted on this base. They are controversial." And you know, when you think about that, isn't it true that once again the Bill of Rights and the Constitution are controversial? And it was in this kind of atmosphere in which the Bill of Rights and the Constitution were declared controversial that my parents were on trial for their lives with the vague charge of conspiracy to commit espionage. But despite that charge, they were really tried and sentenced in the public's mind for giving the secret of the atomic bomb to the Soviet Union. And they were tried and found guilty in March of 1951 before federal Judge Irving R. Kaufman, who pronounced the death penalty in early April. Now, their attorneys worked for over 2 years to have the verdict overturned. They appealed to the Supreme Court 9 times. The court refused to review the record 9 times. So the Supreme Court never looked at the case. They then asked for executive clemency, first of President Truman and then of President Eisenhower, and both of those requests were turned down. Now, because the charge against them was conspiracy, there was no need for the government. Well, let me just take a step back. What does conspiracy mean? Well, the simplest definition is 2 or more people get together and plan to do something illegal, if it's an illegal conspiracy, and take one act in furtherance of their plan. Well, if it's all about 2 or more people getting together and making a plan, you don't need any tangible evidence, in my parents' case, that anybody had actually stolen anything or given it to anybody. In fact, the key government witnesses were charged with the same conspiracy, and the key evidence against my parents was their oral testimony. And these key government witnesses received favorable treatment in return for testifying that my parents were guilty. David and Ruth Greenglass, my mother's younger brother and his wife, were the chief prosecution witnesses. They testified that Julius, with Ethel's help, recruited David into an atomic spy ring in 1944. You see, David was an Army sergeant. He was a machinist working at Los Alamos in New Mexico, where the bomb was being fabricated. And David and Ruth both swore that David gave sketches and a description of the bomb to Julius at the Rosenberg apartment in 1945, and that Ethel was present during these meetings and typed up David's handwritten notes about the bomb. Now, in return for this cooperation on the part of the government witnesses, Ruth Greenglass, who swore she helped steal what the prosecution called, quote, the most important scientific secret ever known to mankind, was never even indicted, and she got to stay home and take care of their 2 children. You see, the Greenglasses had 2 young children, just as my parents did, me and my brother. I was 4 at the time of the trial, and my brother was 7. Now, my parents took the stand in their defense. They denied that this took place, but they invoked the 5th Amendment under repeated prosecution questions about their political affiliations. And this was the McCarthy period. And many believed at that point that refusal to answer, to take the 5th Amendment when asked if you were a communist, was essentially an admission of Communist Party membership. And many also believed that if you were a communist, then you were probably a spy for the Soviet Union. Judge Kaufman's sentencing speech, in which he justified a death sentence in the wake of a conspiracy conviction, made the political context of my parents' case alarmingly clear. Here's what he said. I'm just going to read a small portion of it. He said, quote, "I consider your crimes worse than murder. I believe your conduct in putting into the hands of the Russians the A-bomb years before our best scientists predicted Russia would perfect the bomb has already caused, in my opinion, the communist aggression in Korea, with the resultant casualties exceeding 50,000, And who knows how many millions more of innocent people may pay the price of your treason. So you see, even the judge, in describing the crime, described it as treason, even though that wasn't what they were charged with, and blamed them for the Korean War and said the atomic scientists predicted the Soviet Union wouldn't get the bomb as quickly as it did. And you'd think from that that a lot of atomic scientists testified at my parents' trial, but none did. In fact, a chorus of atomic scientists later made statements that the Russians, that there was no secret of the atomic bomb. These people included people like Harold Urey, Robert Oppenheimer, and one scientist who said later in a television show about the case in the 1970s that building the atomic bomb was an industry, not a recipe. And the atomic scientists didn't get to view the sketches that were presented at my parents' trial until years after my parents' execution. You see, my parents had a co-defendant named Morton Sobel, and he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. And his lawyers had this idea. They said, if we can get these sketches, which were impounded at the trial so as not to damage our national security, if we can force their release and show them to scientists who say they have no value, we might get Morton Sobel released from prison because it would justify reducing his sentence. So finally the government, over government objections, a judge in the mid-1960s ordered these sketches released, and they were taken to atomic scientists who submitted affidavits. I'll quote you from one in which an assessment that the Greenglass material was, quote, too incomplete, ambiguous, and even incorrect to be of any service or value to the Russians in shortening the time required to develop their nuclear bombs. That's what Dr. Henry Lynchitz said. Now, just so that you don't take my word for it, I've actually blown up Exhibit 8. This is Exhibit 8 from my parents' trial. It says, Exhibit 8, government, March 12, 1951, that's the middle of the trial. It says, cross-section A-bomb not to scale. I always think that it looks kind of like a pie with slices cut out. This is the greatest secret known to mankind. And in fact, during the 1970s, when my brother and I were involved, when we were involved in the reopening effort, we actually had T-shirts made of these because it was a great way to start conversations about the case. So what's that? That's the secret of the atomic bomb. In any event, perhaps some of you want to get a closer look at it later. It wasn't until December of 2001 that David Greenglass broke his 50-year silence and on the CBS News program 60 Minutes 2 said he lied when he swore he remembered that my mother was present during this meeting and did the typing. And then he went on to say that government prosecutors pressured him into making these statements. Well, I can't really give you a thorough examination of my parents' case in 15 minutes, but that gives you a sense of what went on and how this kind of scare tactics about the greatest secrets known to mankind led to an execution in a time of political hysteria. And what kind of lessons can we draw from this today? Well, specifically, there are several chilling parallels between my parents' case and the anti-terrorism cases of today, even though politically, my parents, who were secular Jewish communists, couldn't be further apart. Most of these cases are directed at Islamic fundamentalists. But if you step back and you look at this in kind of more social, psychosocial terms, you know, in my parents' case, what the federal prosecutors did was they linked the thing the public feared the most at the time, which was the atomic bomb, to the people the public feared the most, communists. And it all took place against the backdrop of war. Thousands were dying in Korea, about 1,000 a month for a 36-month period. Now, compared to today, well, what do we have? We have federal prosecutors taking the thing the public fears the most, weapons of mass destruction, and linking it to the people the public fears the most, Islamic fundamentalists. And of course, our administration has succeeded in putting us in a perpetual state of war. Thousands were killed on September 11th, but more than the numbers killed on September 11th, more American soldiers have been killed in Iraq and Afghanistan since we invaded and are now occupying those countries. And that doesn't talk about the tens, even hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and Afghanis who've died in those conflicts. And the politically charged atmosphere of the 1950s made it next to impossible to save my parents' lives. And the same kind of atmosphere presents a daunting challenge, not only to save the lives of those who may come to face the death penalty after being convicted of terrorism-related crimes, but also to guarantee due process to the victims of religious profiling or to environmental activists who are now being tarred with the same terrorist brush. But you know, we haven't really seen the wave of capital conspiracy cases across the United States that I feared. Unfortunately, this has happened because things are worse than I feared. Hundreds of people were detained in this country and remain detained in this country in legal limbo outside of the country in Guantanamo, and who knows how many thousands are detained in CIA-controlled black site prisons around the world. Some numbers run up to 10,000. We don't know the numbers because we have absolutely no access to these facilities. What's going on here? Well, the administration in these circumstances is trying to do an end run around our judicial system. What the President of the United States is doing is he's trying to place himself above all laws. You know, we hear Bush and some of his minions on the TV saying repeatedly that the old rules don't apply because after September 11th, there are new circumstances. We've all heard something similar to that. But what we don't hear is what follows from that, which is not only do the old rules not apply, but he gets to say, I get to make all the new rules, and there's no one on earth who has the power to review my new rules. Well, why do you need to do that? Well, I believe that the answer is pretty simple. This president and his group essentially want to run the world. But you know, the problem with running the world, even if you're very powerful, even if you have a lot of money, even if you have a tremendous amount of technology, even if you have the biggest war machine ever this world has ever seen, the problem with that is the world is a very big and complicated place. And any plan by a small group to run the entire world is going to end up being horrifically expensive, as we are all finding out, and equally, if not more, bloody, as unfortunately we are also finding out. And if you're going to mount such an expensive and bloody plan, where the stakes couldn't be higher, you can't allow a little thing like domestic dissent to undermine this plan. And that's where the more general lessons come in. You know, it was just 6 weeks and 1 day after September 11th that Bush signed the USA Patriot Act into law. 342 pages of complex and far-reaching legislation that was passed almost without debate. Now, I'm not going to address the details of the Patriot Act. I think probably most of you know the gist of them. A summary overview shows that in the name of security, Congress conferred vast and unchecked powers on the executive branch of government, in particular the president, and this law included the suspension of civil liberties. That included the silencing of dissent by characterizing dissent as terrorism, by putting language into the Patriot Act that essentially said if you're trying to coerce the government, if you're trying to develop, coerce the government into taking your position, which could be a definition of what civil disobedience is all about, then you're guilty of terrorism. And other things included a lot of invasion of privacy. Now, my first thought when all of this was passed, just 6 weeks after 9/11, and even though there was little debate, it was actually presented to Congress about 10 days before that. So when it was passed so quickly and brought to Congress so quickly, my first thought was, how did they throw this together in less than a month? Well, the answer is they didn't. This was the wish list of an administration that was already hostile to civil liberties. The minute they had an excuse, they trotted it out and they rammed it through. And they didn't have to start from scratch because they had the discredited laws of the McCarthy period to provide them with a ready-made blueprint. In fact, if you go back and read some of those old McCarthy laws, and I don't recommend it because reading laws oftentimes is it'll cure your insomnia, though if you read McCarthy-era laws, you might end up with nightmares. But it looks like they took those old McCarthy period laws, and wherever the word communist or subversive appeared, they pulled that word out and they plugged the word terrorist in, and then they put a whole bunch of stuff about computers in it and to modernize it, and all of a sudden, presto, you had the Patriot Act. And it's against this backdrop that environmental activists are being treated as terrorists for property damage crimes. And it is against this backdrop that the government seeks to redefine political ideologies such as anarchism as terrorism. So what do we do about this political climate that authoritarians are seeking to exploit? Well, first, we must beware of those who counsel us to give up our freedoms in the name of national security in order to protect ourselves. Don't fall for the freedom versus security trap. Attack the assumption. Where's the proof that giving up freedom will increase our security? History teaches us that we'll be less free, but no more secure. In fact, we'll come to live in fear of our own security forces. The police and the intelligence agencies that failed to warn us before September 11th, for whatever reason, it certainly wasn't because they lacked money and power. They had plenty of both. Perhaps their problem was that they need a new perspective. Maybe if they spent less time and money harassing dissenters or imprisoning over 2 million of our fellow citizens. There's a recent survey in the United Nations of how many prisoners are kept throughout the world. And it's estimated that there are 8 million people in prison in the world today. 2.2 million of them are in prison in the United States.